Hey everyone, Dr. Emily Sandoz joins me today in session 107 of the Behavioral Observations podcast to talk about her work in ACT and clinical behavior analysis. I found this conversation really fascinating as she shares how she helps people in talk therapy contexts, a setting that most listeners do not practice in. Going into this interview, I assumed we'd get deep into the ACT Hexaflex processes, but we ended up dispensing with a lot of the common mid-level terms of ACT and instead focused on the functional analysis of verbal behavior in the context of a therapy session. I think you'll find Emily's approach to ACT refreshingly direct and simple, and even if you don't have an interest in the talk therapy world, there are tons of connections that you're likely to make, especially in the area of supervision. How might you ask? Well, I can't spoil it here, so be sure to listen to the conversation in its entirety because we do get into that towards the end of the interview. In broadcasting terms, we had what's called a hard out in terms of time. Otherwise, this interview could have gone on for much, much longer. So if this type of content interests you, go to the show notes of this episode at behavioralobservations.com and let me know in the comments, as I'd love to have Emily back to chat some more about this really important topic. We talked about a few books and other resources during the conversation, and I'll have links to those again in the show notes of the episode. So again, just go to behavioralobservations.com and look for session 107. Okay, and this podcast is brought to you by the ACT Bootcamp for Behavior Analysts. Yes, there's a new ACT Bootcamp that is scheduled from March 19th to 22nd in Reno, Nevada. This workshop is taught by a who's who in the ACT community, including Drs. Evelyn Gould, Steve Hayes, Kendra Newsom, Mark Dixon, and a few others, just to name a few. Attendees will earn a total of 32 BACB continuing education units, including 4 ethics and 3 supervision CEUs. If this sounds like something you're interested in, check out praxiscet.com/BOPOD. Or again, just go to the show notes. I have a link in that's much, much easier to find. So, and if you're interested in this, use the code BO50 to save on your registration fees. This session is also brought to you by HRIC Recruiting. If you're looking for your dream job, work directly with agency owner Barb Voss and let her put her 30 plus years of recruiting experience to work for you. Whether you're relocating or just wondering what else is available, go to hricolorado.com and schedule a confidential chat today. All right, I think that's it for opening announcements. So without any further delay, please enjoy this fun conversation with Dr. Emily Sandoz.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Dr. Emily Sandoz, welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast. How are you doing today?
Thanks so much, Matt. I'm doing great, actually.
Well, this is I think was it Tarbox who did the intro? This is yet another Tarbox interview. Jonathan working behind the scenes to make sure the ACT message gets out there to the great unwashed and maybe the partially washed or the fully whatever. Again, thanks for joining me today. So let's. I know we've got a limited amount of time here, so let's just kick this off like we usually do with every show. And why don't you tell us how you got into behavior analysis and kind of trace that through your kind of career arc into what you're doing these days?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so happy to. I was in psychology, was my undergrad major. And I remember sitting in the intro class and being really frustrated by like how one chapter had nothing to do with the next chapter and that chapter had nothing to do with the next chapter. So sort of every single chapter had this entirely different perspective that it was offering. And I found that really sort of confusing and frustrating, but I held out hope that in the classes to come, I would sort of be blessed with the knowledge that would tie all this together. And it really didn't happen, right? So I'd take a whole class on social psychology or take a whole class on physiological psychology. And it just seemed like all of that language language, all of that analysis, all of that kind of conceptualization, all of that stuff that was the answer to like, why do people do the things that they do? It was entirely different in every course. So I became disenchanted with psychology. I remember sitting down with a dear mentor of mine, although at the time I think he was a begrudging mentor, Dr. David Greenway. He was actually a graduate of UNM's clinical program. He was a student of Dr. Mike Dewar's. And I sat down with Dr. Greenway and just sort of expressed my discontent and told him that I was, leaving for the hard sciences. I'm putting those in quotes here for those who can see me, because I just felt like this is slippery. This is nonsense. None of it hangs together at all. And it was like I had asked the magic question. He said, well, what makes it all hang together? And pretty much pointed me to behaviorism. He was an enthusiastic advocate of behaviorism. And for me, that little taste of being able to look at behavior in context and understand it in terms of that functional relationship between context and behavior, it made the whole rest of psychology make sense. In every single class I was in, it didn't feel like I was waiting for the professor to give me the magic term that was only associated with that subdiscipline. I was really able to think about these phenomena as long as I understood what the professor meant by diffusion of responsibility or insecure attachment or, major depressive disorder or whatever it was. As long as I kind of could get what they meant by it in a common language sense, then I could back translate it to behavioral terms, to behavioral principles. And then he gave me a job, which really kind of locked it in.
Yeah, that's usually a good formative experience there. So what was the gig? What was the gateway drug?
He hooked me up with Dr. Meeta Patel. So Dr. Meeta Patel had her own business, and she was a UNR graduate, and she was doing work in autism and feeding disorders. So we were in a home program. We had a kiddo that was getting 40 hours a week. There were 5 of us line therapists, and Meeta was such an incredible supervisor. So she was not located in Lafayette, where I was living, where I actually have returned to and live now. She was off still living, I think, in Novato at the time, and she was incredible at making sure that we not only sort of knew what to say, knew kind of the topography or the form of the programming, but why. She was really receptive to our observations. She was doing that translating, so we'd kind of observe in our common language speak, and then she would help us back translate that into adaptations to the program. I went on and got my master's here in Lafayette, still kind of flirting with behavior analysis, and the struggle that I had was how does this apply to all the stuff that got me to psychology in the first place? So behavior analysis or behaviorism made psychology make sense, but the stuff that got me to psychology was stuff that I wasn't really finding behavioral accounts of, or if there were, I couldn't understand them, admittedly, because I was so fresh and so green, but I was wondering about things like yearning, or things like a persistent sort of frustration that results in inaction. I was wondering about how we talk about grief or bereavement. And that's when Dr. Rick Perkins, who was another Mike Dewar student, handed me the 1999 ACT book. So it was just a year or two old at that point, and him having the more subtle approach than Dr. Greenway, he just sort of slid the book my way, a little sort of kind of joy in his voice and saying, like, I think this might make sense to you. And of course, I got probably 20 pages in, and I'm like, this isn't behaviorism.
Okay, I wanted to ask you, given that early formative experience working and feeding and the kind of quote unquote traditional ABA, I was curious what that initial impression of the book was.
I did not get it. I mean, I got it, experientially. It touched me emotionally. I mean, that first line is something like, the single most incredible fact about human existence is how hard it is for humans to be happy. And I mean, I was hooked. Like, that's the stuff. That's what brought me to psychology. But I absolutely did not get it. I did not get how it was behavior analysis. I remember like sort of fighting with Dave and Rick. And they were incredibly supportive. So every time, I was hooked with ACT. I was hooked first with behaviorism, making the rest of psychology make sense. Then I was hooked with ACT. And then we really leaned in on RFT, trying to understand more things like rule-governed behavior, stuff that just really wasn't included in my one learning class, that I had in undergrad. So I really struggled as much as I enjoyed that translating, all of those other psych classes, translating all of those concepts from other psych classes into behavioral terms, or trying. I mean, I wasn't very good at it. The more that I sort of, as much as I enjoyed that, it felt overwhelming to then take something, that was such a different way of thinking about human suffering, such a different way of thinking about human thriving. It was like that was already too big of a haul for me to then add on top of that, okay, well, what is this? How is this behavioral? How is this from behavioral foundations? How do you start, with a Skinnerian sort of appreciation of functional relationships between context and behavior and land here? And that's how I landed in at Ole Miss working on my PhD. So I, finished my master's here in Lafayette. I taught and was ambivalent for a few years. I really, really, really enjoyed, we were doing very traditional discrete trial training and floor time. And I really, really enjoyed that. I felt super passionately about it. It's the most gratifying work, probably that I've done to date. It was really, really meaningful. I was learning so much. And so part of me really thought like, maybe I should just do this, maybe I should kind of hang here and I can use the ACT stuff for myself and kind of, just for my own self-improvement. So I waffled for a couple years and then ended up applying out. And when I applied out for doctoral training, I applied to all places where there were ACT people. So, I applied to the typical spots, which at the time there were like, 10. So I applied to all of them. And when I left Ole Miss's interview weekend, I cried. So Oxford is like 6 hours from Lafayette, and I was just driving and just sobbing. And my partner at the time was going, I thought you had a lot of fun. I did have a lot of fun. Sobbing because it felt perfect. The faculty there for a clinical program, the faculty there were very behavioral. We had 4 or 5 professors that was really their primary orientation. I was going to be able to work with Kelly Wilson, who was an author on that ACT book that had been handed to me, 6 years earlier. It really felt like where I needed to be. Plus, the DCT, the director of clinical training, his band played at interview weekend. His blues.
Oh man.
I was totally hooked. Yeah, that's Dr. Alan Gross, another mentor of mine. I was totally hooked. And so I landed there.
Talk about a captive audience. I'm sorry. I just had to you have to were you compelled to clap? There's a lot of pressure there as an audience member, right?
Well, fortunately, they were incredibly skilled.
Okay,
so,
all right.
We were dancing, let alone clapping. Clapping came easily. It was a great time. It was
all right. If they got up there and just played like Smoke on the Water or something like that, I could see where the pressure would be to, feign, mild applause. But I digress, and I interrupted you, so please continue.
No, it was perfect. So I knew that I really wanted it, and ended up getting an offer. And so I landed at Ole Miss as, Kelly's new graduate student, and worked with Kelly Wilson there. I was there for 5 years. So in Oxford for 4 of those, and then our last year is residency. And so from the time I landed there, it was really, I made it my business to get this stretch, to get this sort of stretch between empirical clinical psychology, which was going to be kind of the name of my degree, and behaviorism, which sort of had my heart and soul. Kelly used to say that we go to ABCT, the kind of empirical clinical conference, that we go to ABCT to keep up with the latest in empirical clinical treatments, but we go to ABAI to save our behavioral souls.
Nice.
So continuing to kind of drink from that font. And yeah, that was really it for me throughout that time. I was incredibly fortunate. There wasn't certification or licensure of behavior analysts. So what I did is took that experience that I had gotten under Dr. Patel and worked under Dr. Sheila Williamson and Dr. Emily Johnson, who are both behavior analysts, actually writing some programs for paraprofessionals. So sort of would consult in these classrooms. It'd be 5 or 6, paraprofessionals in there doing, a lot of things that were important, like washing kids' hands and helping them to, color a picture. And I started just writing some programming, like what's a behavior that would make your life really easy, much easier, and make this child have better days at school. That was always Sheila's question about a target behavior. We had to pick a behavior that would help a child have a better day at school. And so the whole time that I was, in my clinical training program, I was constantly with a foot in either world, with a foot in, empirical clinical psychology, still doing ABA and supervising paraprofessionals in ABA, and, having these emerging skills in talk therapy.
Are you looking for a new job, but you're overwhelmed with all the emails that you're getting from various ABA agencies? What if there was someone who was in your corner and could help you find the perfect job placement? Well, that person exists. Barbara Voss has been working as a recruiter for over 30 years, and her company, HRIC, specializes in placing BCBAs in permanent full-time positions throughout the United States. Barbara has been placing BCBAs since 2011, so she knows our business, and she offers personalized service to any BCBA looking for a new position. She also helps companies looking to hire BCBAs too. Here are just some of the things Barbara can help you with. She can provide information about salary ranges in different markets across the country. She can help you write your resume. She can coordinate and prepare you for the interview process, and even help negotiate the right salary for you. And best of all, there are no charges to any candidate for all of these services. When you're ready to make a change and want to work with someone who will listen to you and understand what you need in a new position, contact Barbara at HRIC. To schedule a confidential discussion, head over to hricolorado.com. Again, that's hricolorado.com, and hit the contact button to connect with Barbara. You won't be disappointed. Well, tell me about that transition. What was it like to sit down with your first patient or client, or what, I don't know, whatever the right term is, but having, I guess a shift in this population, right?
Yeah, the biggest difference, really from all of that, work was for me. So one is most of the clients that I did, really just most of my clients generally in terms of the ABA work that I was doing, most of them were nonverbal or barely verbal. I mean, they weren't doing derived relational responding. They were just getting some words and not a lot of transformation of function or anything happening verbally. So I really was puzzled about how exactly this was going to work. The experience then, it was overwhelming. It was intimidating. It was folks. I found that when folks started talking, I would sort of take off my behavioral hat, which was a hard habit to break. It was really hard once humans started saying words. It was really hard to functionally analyze the talking behavior as behavior in context and not get kind of hooked into the content of the story that we're telling that was happening some other time and place that I couldn't directly observe, that I couldn't analyze, that I could only go by the kind of their report of what was what was happening at that time. So that shift, to understanding that talking behavior, that languaging, that thinking and feeling all as behavior happening in context right now, was a huge adjustment. It was tough. And Kelly was remarkably supportive in terms of really pushing us on, sort of the multiple levels of understanding clients' just streams of behavior. Kelly worked with Dr. Linda Hayes for a while. And, with her as one of his supervisors, we sort of got like that phase, I guess, of my behaviorism. A big difference was getting that influence from more Cantorian ways of thinking. So the behavioral stream, the sort of bi-directional arrow between all of the constantly changing elements of context and all of those different behaviors that are occurring now and now and now, sort of acknowledging the artificiality or the arbitrary nature of that one behavior that we peel out and say, it's this behavior I'm going to be watching. That was incredibly rich and really lent itself much better to clinical work than my more traditional way of thinking about behaviors, which is almost mechanistic, honestly. In the beginning, it felt very mechanistic to me.
So was that I don't want to read too much into what you're saying, but it sounded like when you said it was hard to take your behaviorist hat off, and was it because you were was leaving your behaviorist hat on too mechanistic? Is that what you're saying, or was that a problem? I guess to be solved.
Yeah, it was. So it was more like I would find myself automatically taking off my behaviorist hat.
Okay.
So compelled by the language.
Oh, okay. I'm with you now.
So if somebody started telling me like, man, I was really, struggling yesterday, I'm imagining them, in yesterday struggling. I'm not noticing that their voice is wavering as they say that, or that they look like they're about to throw up, or they look like they're about to bolt out of the room, or that I'm not noticing that right before they said that they struggled yesterday, I had actually asked, how was the thing that happened last week, or that right after they said that, they quickly changed the subject and started talking about an assignment. Like I was missing all of the richness in the speaking as a behavioral event and all of the richness of the contextual the context in which that behavior of speaking and languaging was situated, and all of the stuff that I couldn't see, missing all of that because their story was so compelling that I'd start to imagine it, and then I'd start to respond to that, so saying, something like, and then what happened, to sort of get the next bit of the story, instead of seeing their behavioral stream as an opportunity for intervention. And with the influence of, like I said, my mentor, Dr. Kelly Wilson, and then a mentor that sort of emerged over the course of my graduate training, Dr. Kate Kellum, both of those being Linda Hayes students, that interbehavioral sort of piece and adding the fluidity, the sort of dynamic nature, the breadth and complexity, sort of leaning back into that was something that really allowed me, I felt like, to keep my behavioral hat on. I didn't have to chunk this incredibly complex stream of behaviors, much of which I could not, necessarily directly observe, but they were still influencing the client. I didn't need to sort of chunk those into little bits in order to be able to effectively intervene. I could take a more So
two things. One is I want to take a step back and kind of make sure, because the one of the things that we're going to, I guess the overall theme here is talking about clinical behavior analysis. And so before we get too far into this, because I want to just keep asking questions about this topic, but I want to make sure I have the benefit of having some conversation with you previous to this. So I want to make sure we don't lose the audience as we're chatting along here. So let's take a few steps back and talk a little bit about, okay, what is clinical behavior analysis from your perspective? So that we all are on kind of the same footing.
Absolutely. And that's actually kind of where I was landing. So to me, the thing that makes clinical behavior analysis different from other kinds of talk therapy or psychotherapy is that we are actually focused on the behavior that's being emitted or evoked right there in front of us. So that behavioral stream that's unfolding right there in front of us that we're directly observing, directly intervening on, where our behavior is, our meaning the therapist, where the therapist is shifting context, via their own behavior. That's the primary sort of bit, mostly using words. It's talk therapy. But that the focus of that is not to make some, mental change, is not to invoke some, shift inside the human that they're then going to go out into the world and implement. That the focus of it is actually on directly intervening on the behavior that I'm directly observing. So, clinical behavior analysis, as distinct from other psychotherapies, we're focused on the behavior in the room. We're focused on building the repertoire right there in the room, and making sure that it's exhibited. Those behavior changes are exhibited outside the room by using language that's functionally similar to those contexts outside of the room where, the struggles are occurring. So there's distinguishing clinical behavior analysis from typical psychotherapy, and then there's distinguishing clinical behavior analysis from any other area of applied behavior analysis. And I think that's actually the harder job. So the way that I think about that, and it's been defined certainly by several folks. There's a whole edited book that Mike Dewar edited on clinical behavior analysis. There's a couple of special issues and that are out there on clinical behavior analysis. And then, of course, there's a couple of papers that were written defining clinical behavior analysis really for a clinical psych audience. And what some folks have said is that clinical behavior analysis is behavior analysis applied in an individual therapy, sort of with adults for psychopathology. I actually really hate that definition. So that's not what I mean at all. I think that it's not about how old the person is, and it's not about if it's individual or group, and it's not about how often they come into the office or anything like that. For me, what distinguishes clinical behavior analysis from other kinds of applied behavior analysis, and I do think of it in terms of other kinds of applied behavior analysis, I think it's the extent to which we're using words and relying on verbal governance to change contingencies. When I'm doing, it's kind of like ABA as psychotherapy is what I mean as clinical behavior analysis. And that as psychotherapy piece just means talk, like using words. Psychotherapy is talk therapy. So can I create the context in which learning occurs right there in the office, in which the repertoire changes right there in my therapy office in such a way that the person experiences more meaningful and effective living out in their life. And that emphasis on verbal governance, on using words to do that, using words to create evocative, context that create problem behavior, using words that add to that evocative context to expand the repertoire. That to me is what clinical behavior analysis means. So if I had my druthers, I would redefine it as that, because when I say it, that's what I mean.
Is that the same as what people refer to as functional analytic psychotherapy?
Yeah, so I would say that functional analytic psychotherapy is certainly a clinical behavior analytic approach.
Okay.
Now, that said, I think that you could do FAP or ACT or any clinical behavior analytic approach in a way that is not clinical behavior analysis. So you could do it as a psychotherapy that's not actually CBA. So for example, if I look, instead of orienting towards functional analytic psychotherapy's emphasis on CRB1s, clinically relevant behavior, 1s and 2s, so preferred behaviors and not preferred behaviors for this particular client, instead of focusing on that as a live thing happening in the moment, if I turned instead to FAP's mid-level terms, awareness, courage, and love, well, then I could just start doing functional analytic psychotherapy in a way that says, as long as the client and I are aware and courageous and loving, then I'm doing FAP. And that does not necessarily orient me towards a behavior analytic approach. It doesn't necessarily orient me towards functionally analyzing, the behavior that's occurring right there in front of me. Same thing with ACT. I think that we could, if we appeal to those mid-level terms and kind of stop there, then we could end up doing ACT in such a way that is not clinical behavior analysis.
Okay, I want to get to those mid-level terms in just a second, but there's something I can't let go here that we touched on briefly earlier, and I got hooked on your story about getting hooked on stories. So let's go back a few minutes. You said you're catching yourself getting hooked on people's stories about what's happening in their lives and things like that. I guess one of the things that popped into my mind, is there value just from an assessment standpoint to listening to those stories? And I don't know if it's a zero-sum game. I don't know if it's a complete and or, but is there a value from perhaps even just a functional assessment standpoint where someone's talking about how, I'm failing at an example, but let's say they have some sort of relationship problem and they end up doing something that inadvertently reinforces the behavior of on the part of a spouse or partner that they don't like or whatever. And you only get that by listening to their story and asking, and then what happened? And then what happened? So, what is the relative value of that versus and I'm fascinated by this kind of in the room concept that you're describing here as well.
Yeah.
Can
So totally. Okay. So let's think about what's actually happening in that moment. So if I'm sitting with a client and they're saying, well, I had this really frustrating interaction with my husband. He came in and he snapped at me about not having the dishes done. So, I went ahead and did them, but I still felt really hurt. And we're going, if you don't want to be snapped at, probably shouldn't be doing the dishes when he snaps at you about it, right? Like inadvertently reinforcing that problematic behavior. So the behavior that I'm actually observing, though, we could conceptualize it a number of ways. So one is, tracking. Like, is she tracking what happens, like the actual consequences of her behavior? And could I build that up? I could say she's really not tracking. She's not seeing how reinforcing that snapping behavior actually makes it happen more often. So I might see kind of a target there, right? That she needs to do some better tracking. That's what I would be thinking, while she was telling me that story. So I'd have the the little alarm go off, certainly. So I'm listening for those qualities. But then what I would do is I would look for situations in the therapy room that are functionally similar to that. So I would see, well, can she track an interaction that we have? Would she be able to note the consequences of something that just occurred, of a behavior that we have that shared experience? Well, then I can actually assess a lot better if she's tracking accurately or not. This story about what happened out in the world, it's fine. And I certainly listen because, listening and attending is like one of my best reinforcers in the room. So I'm certainly listening. And I might be saying, man, maybe tracking is a behavior that we should be targeting in here. Like maybe she's kind of crummy at that. Right. But if we think about that tracking behavior, I'm also going to say, let's say that I probe it and she can't track even in our interactions. So I say something like, I noticed just now that you said that you didn't want to talk about this. And then suddenly you're talking about it. What shows up for you as I mentioned that, or what do you kind of make of that? Let's say that she does a really bad job linking what's happening to, around her to what she's actually doing. Well, there's actually a lot of behaviors that are made up that make up tracking. So then I would be asking myself, okay, she can't do that. Can she even notice what she's doing? Like independent of context, can she tell me, what behavior she just engaged in? Can she link that behavior to other behaviors that are functionally similar? Can she notice, what's showing up in her private world? What thoughts or feelings she's having? Is she able to do any of that are all component skills of tracking? If I just stay right with the content of the story, then we might end up like problem behavior is inadvertently reinforcing, partners, mean way of speaking. But I haven't even actually observed that. And I don't know that that's the functional relationship at all. If I can create a similar situation, I can directly observe that difficulty tracking. Then I can see, can I create the conditions under which she could do that? And if I can't, can I reach back to some other component skills that she might actually not have those behaviors in her repertoire and try to build that, right? If we did the alternative, if I sort of offered my conceptualization, like, have you ever tried, for example, doing this other thing, let's say, and maybe we have this whole conversation. Let's think about the behaviors I would be able to directly intervene on and, consequate and, so evoke and consequate and make happen in her repertoire. So if we start having that conversation, like a problem solving and a planning conversation, those are the skills that I'm directly observing. I'm not directly observing her saying, hey, hold up, you can't talk to me like that. I'm not doing the dishes. Screw you. If that was the target behavior, I'm not directly observing that. I'm directly observing her problem solving behavior, and I'm shaping her problem solving behavior, and I'm directly observing her planning behavior. And we're talking about planning and we're reinforcing that planning. And maybe we do a little practice. But even then, if I don't have the functions that her partner does, then she can practice screw you all day. It doesn't mean that she's going to be able to go home and do it with her partner, with whom she has a much longer learning history of this thing happening. Instead, I think it makes a lot more sense, and it's a lot more consistent with how I think of as clinical behavior analysis, to say, listen to that to figure out what the functional target is, what the functional sort of behavioral deficit or behavioral excess is that's being exhibited in this moment. And then instead of training, I call it the hope and plan model, instead of a plan and hope model. And then instead of shifting to the plan and hope model, where we make a plan and I just really hope that those words magically organize her behavior, I'm going to create the context for her to practice behaviors that are going to be really useful in that. So if being assertive was a target behavior, then I need to create all of those aversive contexts. I need to get her engaging in that passivity, all of that problem behavior, and then add to the context so I can expand her repertoire. If it's shame, if it's guilt, if it's fear that is present when her husband, snaps at her, or whatever it is, then those are the kinds of things I need her experiencing. And then however she responds to guilt and shame and fear, I need her engaging in those responses right there in the room so I can get that whole problematic functional response class happening in front of me. And then I can add to the context, add to the context, add to the context as I'm adding to the context without taking away that aversive, right? The mean husband is still psychologically present. So without taking away that aversive, I'm expanding her repertoire and transforming the function of mean husband comments such that she has more freedom, more opportunities, more possibilities for action. And that's no longer functioning as an aversive at that point. So at the point that she has her full complex repertoire, that's not actually an aversive experience, even if it hurts, right? It's still not aversive if she has her whole repertoire at hand and it's not just about getting away.
Are you hearing about all this ACT stuff and wondering whether it's for you? Are you interested in acceptance and commitment therapy, but are concerned that it's outside the scope of your training? And finally, can you get away for a few days at the end of March? If so, then consider attending the ACT Bootcamp for Behavior Analysts that's taking place in Reno, Nevada from March 19th through 22nd. This workshop will give attendees a deeper understanding of the roots of ACT, including how verbal behavior is extended by relational frame theory. Behavior analysts will also learn skills and techniques they can use to increase psychological flexibility with their clients while still staying within the scope of their practice. The ACT Bootcamp for Behavior Analysts workshop is taught by a who's who in the ACT and ABA world, including Drs. Evelyn Gould, Steve Hayes, Kendra Newsom, and Mark Dixon, just to name a few. Attendees will earn a total of 32 BACB continuing education units, including 4 ethics and 3 supervision CEUs. So if you want to learn more, go to praxiscet.com/BOPOD, or just simply go to the show notes for this episode. And if you end up signing up for it, use the code BO50 to save on your registration. Again, this is the ACT Bootcamp for Behavior Analysts that's taking place in Reno, Nevada from March 19th through 22nd. And go ahead and hit the show notes for a link to get more information. So basically, if I'm understanding you correctly, you kind of populate the session with EOs for problem behavior, right?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Now,
absolutely.
so could you give me an example of a very specific example how you do that? Do you do that in role play? And is, do you say, hey, I'm going to be, an a-hole here for a minute and I'm going to, talk like, or is it more subtle than that? I'm just curious about the ways in which, and of course, I'm sure it's different based off of the various presenting challenges, of course, and the severities of them, I'd imagine. But can you give us a couple examples about how you do that, how you pull that off?
Sure. Well, so the first thing is it's not a rule, right? I'm constantly evaluating, like, am I having the impact I want to be having? Like, what is the functional relationship between what I'm doing and what the client is doing? So I'm constantly kind of aware of that. So I don't necessarily come in with a rule about the best way to do that. My preference, though, is not actually to use a lot of formal exercises or disrupt the free conversation, the natural feeling and sounding conversation, in part because I want to bring in as much of the context, from the outside world into our interaction. And it's weird, like, okay, let's stop and do an exercise. I do some of that, but I try my best to kind of keep it a natural conversation. It's more consistent with people's expectations for psychotherapy as well. So it might be something as simple as, Matt, that, I wonder what's something hard that happened to you yesterday, right? That might be kind of a first hit. It might be something like, it looks like there's hard stuff that you're carrying today. I'm noticing that you look a little anxious. What's going on for you? What shows up as I say that? So the way that I know, really, it's anything. I could say good morning, and that could be an evocative context, in part because the way that I assess if the aversive is in the room is if I'm observing behavior under aversive control. So if I'm seeing behavior that for that client is running, fighting, or hiding, then I don't even need to know what the aversive is, right? I know that whatever I just did got some running, fighting, or hiding going. I've got an aversive in the room, and then we can start to work, right? I'm not going to work. We can do some work without the aversive in the room, but to the extent that I understand their behavior as being, attributable to aversive control, their problematic behavior as being attributable to aversive control, and to the extent that I'm about freedom from aversive control, consistent with sort of a Skinnerian analysis of freedom, then, my goal is looking for that running, fighting, hiding behavior, looking for that behavior under aversive control, and then adding to the context to build the repertoire. So it could almost be anything. Some people, especially like first or second session, they're already running, fighting, or hiding. They're terrified to be coming to therapy. They've been thinking in the car the whole time about having to talk about that trauma experience or whatever they imagine it's going to be like. I should say that I think about aversive and appetitive control. I don't just reduce that to negative and positive reinforcement. And so I just like to put a couple words around that.
Yeah.
People struggle with, I think sometimes if you think too hard about positive and negative reinforcement, because it feels like a syntax game. If I put on my sweater, am I escaping cold or seeking heat?
Oh, sure. Yeah, there's that whole issue of the behavior analyst. What about 10 or 15 years ago?
Yes. So my argument is like that's just a terrible way to split the world. Like, let's not split it in terms of am I accessing or getting rid of? Like that's really bizarre. And I think it's pretty bizarre if you take a more contextual standpoint or an interbehavioral standpoint. So I think instead about the whole repertoire. So repertoires that are dominated by aversive control are tight and rigid. That response class is completely dominated by behaviors that are about getting away from stuff, right? And what that means is that, it's hard to disrupt the behavioral stream. If you get other behaviors, they're topographically different, but they're still avoidance related. They're still focused on avoidance. It's hard to introduce new contexts, right? The attention is solely focused on the aversives, and anything anything related to the aversives, but other stuff, like really, it's just not context, right? It might be happening, but it's not impacting the behavior. It's not related to the behavioral stream. On the other hand, appetitive control is a total opposite, right? When we see a repertoire that is dominated by appetitive control, we see like the functional relationship between context and behavior is a lot more dynamic. We see things sort of slipping into the context and the organism kind of orienting and then being able to orient back to this other thing. We see functionally different behaviors happening, sort of one after another, learning that's not about getting away, learning that's not just adding new avoidant behaviors to the pile, right? But that are part of building functionally distinct response classes, because context is more variable and more dynamic in a repertoire under aversive control, and behaviors are more variable and more dynamic. And the functional relationship between those contexts and behaviors are more variable and more dynamic. The organism is easily able to sort of shift and grow. It's easy to disrupt. So that's what I'm looking for. If I want to know, is there an aversive in the room? Was what I just did an EO for some avoidance here, for some behaviors under aversive control, for some problem behavior. All I need to do is watch the repertoire. If I'm not sure, like somebody's making a joke, maybe, right? I said so what were some of the things that were showing up on your way to work today or on your way to therapy today? Or what are some things that you're carrying right now? What shows up as you kind of sit down and settle in for today's session? Let's say a client makes a really funny joke, right? And they're really funny, so I'm probably going to laugh regardless, without even meaning to, without stopping and functionally analyzing. But I might be asking myself, was that avoidant? Or, was that like the joke showed up, they sort of shifted to that and paid attention to that, and now they're oriented back to this hard thing that they're carrying? Well, I just try to disrupt it, So I just say, if I gently guide them back to the hard thing that just happened, are they able to follow? Is my instruction that I just offered, is that able to serve as context? Are they going to continue to run, fight, and hide? Are they going to engage in some behavior that might be topographically different? It might not be humor, it might be some other avoidant behavior. Are they going to go, oh, before we move on, did you end up depositing that check last week? Because I didn't, are they going to start cycling through the barrel of aversive behaviors under aversive control? Or can I very easily sort of shift them to the next thing? If I can easily shift them to the next thing, maybe back to the hard stuff, well, then I know that, probably functionally speaking, it's fine to think of it as behavior under appetitive control. Probably, I'll need to work a little harder to get the aversive in the room in order to start building the repertoire.
Okay. Wow. So many questions here. So good stuff. So I want to get back to the mid-level terms for a second. What can you just define, to your mind, what is a mid-level term, and what's the big deal about them, I guess, or perhaps what's not the big deal about them?
So my first answer would be something like all of those terms that I was talking about at the beginning, insecure attachment or, whatever. I would say all of those, almost everything that makes up the whole rest of psychology, all of those terms, right? That all of those are mostly mid-level terms. And when I say mid-level, what I mean, and I think this is consistent with most folks in behavior analysis, what I mean are that sometimes we have scientific terms that are situated sort of between those terms that emerge naturally from basic science and kind of common language, right? So common language, my grandmother could understand. If I'm talking to my grandmother about my well-being, I might use these words. Basic scientific principles, those that emerge right out of the basic lab, those kind of have, their status certainly within behavior analysis. Middle level terms are folks kind of carving out a space between that and saying, well, we can have scientific terms that are situated between common language and those basic scientific terms that come right out, that emerge right out of the data.
Yeah, so dimensional units of behavior basically would be. Yeah.
Absolutely. And what those should do, I'm glad that you said that, because that was my next thing, is those should map on to sort of collections of those basics, right? Those basic principles. Like we should be able to, they should cohere perfectly. Even if they're at another level of analysis, they should still be coherent with those basic terms. So if I say something like, insecure attachment, let's say if we took that as a middle level term, that is not emerging from the basic science. I would say certainly not the basic behavior analytics science. But in order for us to say that's a useful middle level term, there's sort of these two criteria. So, or if it's a valid middle level term, is one criterion, and that would be, does it map directly on and cohere directly with a more basic level of analysis? From behavior analysis, it might be like, can I unpack that in basic behavioral terms? That's the validity of it. Now, the utility of it would be, does this orient applied folks towards being able to do what would be implied by that basic level of analysis? So the hope of middle level terms in behavior analysis, at least as far as I understand it, is can we make folks do behavior analysis without having to learn all of the basic behavior analytic terms? Can we sort of wrap some words around, units of those terms, like collections of those terms and ways that they fit together in particular ways? Can we collapse, for example, like context and behavior and maybe function in there and give one term that traps all of that, and then teach somebody that's not a behavior analyst to do things that would be applied by a basic functional analysis or by basic behavior analytic kind of unpacking of that event. We'll see.
So can I ask you a question real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
We've had a bunch of shows on ACT, and of course, we invariably run through the ACT processes, diffusion, acceptance, and things like that. And so those would be mid-level terms, right?
Mid-level terms,
okay.
Yeah. So there would be two questions in saying, like, are these good middle-level terms? In my world, the two questions would be, do they cohere with basic behavior analytic terms, right? Is there a clear collection of phenomena that we know are useful ways of kind of describing the world because of these basic data that we have? Are there collections of those basic terms that clearly define and map onto, in a really reliable way, map onto those middle level terms? That would be about their validity. And then what about their utility? Do they actually orient clinicians towards being able to implement ACT? Do they orient clinicians towards being able to build psychological flexibility in a way that's consistent with the kinds of things maybe that they would do if they understood the basic science or had those basic terms on board? Specific to ACT, it might be, does the Hexaflex turn people who aren't behavior analysts into behavior analysts? Does it empower them to do contextual analyses of the behavior that they're seeing right there in front of them?
I see. That's helpful. Thanks. I'm fascinated by, again, I keep coming back to the session, right? And 90+% of the audience doesn't do what you do. We're not psychotherapists. Yet at the same time, ACT is, as I'm sure you're aware of, super, super popular, even among, or is becoming very popular in mainstream behavior analysis. Mm-hmm. So I've got a couple things I'm wondering about relative to that. And one of the things I've asked a lot of folks who come on and talk about ACT is about scope of practice, scope of competence. There's a lot of ACT workshops going on, and just to add a full, disclosure and transparency, I advertise for a lot of them. Nothing against those, but at the same time, I guess what I'm concerned about is what the people getting a little bit of information and running amok with it. So there's that. But at the same time, too, getting back to this kind of session, one of the things that came up for me is that this sounds like so many things I see, when I'm talking with teachers or paraprofessionals, when they're talking about some of the struggles that they have. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot of like a real translatable information as it relates to supervision or mentoring or management or what have you that is directly maps onto that. I can't tell you, I was having a conversation about this yesterday with someone, how many teachers have broken down and cried to me random guy wearing the visitor sticker, the school visitor sticker, met them for 10 minutes and they're telling me about, how a kid, hit them up, hit him in the head or something like that, or injured a peer who was helpless. And we're not equipped. We're not taught how to really deal with that, in many respects. So I got a lot of things kind of swimming around right now. And so I guess, I always end the interview, and I don't know if we're close to that yet. I know you got to go in a little bit with advice for the newly minted, but I'm oldly minted. I've been certified for a long time. And so I guess more generally, can you talk to, how the type of training we should look for, and not just attending a workshop, but in addition to that, what other types of learning opportunities and mentorship opportunities, and how might we use this in situations like I just described? Or if you, oh my gosh, I can't tell you how many times all those strong emotions come up when you're interviewing a parent, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And we're not, this is a point that Jim Moore brought up to me in one of our conversations a while back of paying attention to some of those emotional responses that you were describing earlier when we're doing a functional assessment interview, so I think there might be there's tons of information we're leaving on the table. So if you can give us some advice about how to attend to those things.
Yeah. So a couple of things, and I have about 15 minutes. So a couple of things are showing up. So one is, generally in terms of what about folks that are licensed as psychotherapists? It doesn't mean that we're not constantly trying to use language, to build repertoires. I mean, we're doing it all the time. If we're consulting with a teacher, if we're training a supervisee, if we're doing behavioral skills training with a parent, if we're doing social skills training. I mean, in the context of ABA, if we have a verbally able kid, to the extent that the problem behaviors that we're observing are about verbally governed aversive control, I think it's actually our responsibility to have on deck some skills about verbally governed interventions that build the repertoire in the presence of aversives. And so, I think that's actually a responsibility. It doesn't have to be in the psychotherapy format. So you could apply acceptance and commitment therapy in a non-clinical setting or a non-clinical relationship, as acceptance and commitment training, where you are still focused on building psychological flexibility, on building out the repertoire in the presence of contextual events that have traditionally functioned as rule-governed aversives. You can do that anytime you're using language. And the thing is, if you're using language to try and change behavior, why would you not focus on the behavior that you can directly observe and intervene on? Why would you not do that trick where you sort of don't get hooked by content and instead of notice the speaking behavior situated in context, and instead of sort of focusing on just that one behavior, looking at the whole repertoire and how it's changing as you're bringing up, different events. You can imagine something like asking a teacher about different settings in which they interact with the child and the different ways that the child's behavior changes between those settings. Well, that's a great opportunity to notice how the teacher's behavior changes in those different settings. Now, to the extent that your prompt, to the extent that the stuff that you're saying and doing is making or is functionally equivalent to those contexts out in the world. So if you can really make recess present for the teacher, it might be something like, all right, so where do y'all have recess? Okay, so you're out there in the yard, there's Joey. Where do you notice him? You hear him before you see him. Where is he? What's going on for you in that moment? You might do some, and then what happens, but you also have the opportunity to watch. Does her repertoire shrink and get really tight? If it does, maybe recess is not the place that you start to first do behavioral skills training with her. If you notice that she's broad and seems hopeful and curious when she talks about Joey in art class, then maybe that's where you start the intervention, right? So there are all these implications, I think, for behavior analysts who do any kind of work with verbally able humans. There are all these implications to looking past that content and to doing what we do best. We understand behavior as a product of its antecedents and consequences. We understand it explicitly linked to that surrounding or situating context. So that's one thing that I would say that's just it's a thing that you can start to practice right away, Now, as far as support to do that, I think that I think that the way that I train and talk about clinical behavior analysis and ACT is not consistent with every ACT training out there. So I would be asking, trainers, consultants, people like that, to what extent they focus on the behavior happening right there in the room. To what extent are they able to train in a way that teaches you to intervene and directly observe. For example, I'm really not a super big fan of telling my client to close their eyes and not behave at all while I do a thing to them. It just makes no sense to me from a behavior analytic perspective. Like, how am I observing the impact that I'm having if I have them close their eyes and they can't do or say anything the whole time I'm talking? Well, that's something that a lot of people get trained to do when they train to do ACT. Close your eyes, imagine this. It doesn't mean don't ever do it. I'm not doing it in the context of psychotherapy, where my job is to build the repertoire, where my job...
Oh, like if you're doing like a Lee's on the stream exercise or something like that.
What am I directly observing? How do I know if they engaged in any diffusion or not? I can't observe anything because I've just restricted them from behaving. Instead, it might be something like, I want you to take a moment. A word stood out for me that you just said. You said worthless. I wonder, kind of as I say it back to you, are you able to observe what your mind is doing here? What's showing up for you? What is your mind saying when I say worthless? And I might continue to say it over and over again. And I'm going to check, can they tune in? I know what that looks like. Like, it looks like somebody pausing, usually looking kind of up and to the left. And then they go, yeah, it's like, you're never going to be anything. I'm like, are there any memories showing up? Yeah, I'm remembering like this one time, and they're able to really observe the thinking that's happening right now. Well, that's what I think of as diffusion, right? Well, master, like that skill is at strength, at least in this particular context around worthlessness and all of the contexts that bring up whatever comes up when I say worthless, in those contexts, this person is able to observe their thinking as a process. Now, if I say, what shows up for you as you hear me say it? Like right now, as I say worthless, can you kind of hear, or listen to what your mind is saying? If the person says, yeah, I am worthless, right? I totally suck. There's no proof otherwise, Well, they're totally in that content. That's more fusion. I'm directly observing that. It's just a lot more valuable to me. Now, I might pause and disrupt and do an exercise, to try and get them in contact with what I'm going for or something. But from a behavior analytics sense, that's when you end up asking questions like, well, what about their private events? And is this all self-report? And how do you know that you're doing something? Well, yeah, because a lot of those exercises are more consistent with a mentalist sort of psychotherapy. I do a thing to you. There's an inside change in your brain or in your mind or in your soul or in your energy, or who knows, there's some kind of personological or characterological change. And then I hope and plan that that magically changes your behavior elsewhere. I'm just not sure as behavior analysts why we would do that. I would really want to know a good reason that we would do that and not instead focus on that directly observable, directly intervenable, uponable behavior. So I would say, ask your trainer, how much do you know about behavior analysis? Ask your trainer, how much is what you're going to teach me something that how much am I going to get the opportunity to generate and be creative with ACT, with ACT principles or processes? How much will you be able to unpack this stuff in behavioral terms or relational frame theory terms? There's a lot of great trainers out there that do that really, really beautifully, that give behavior analysts an opportunity to practice what I think the target behavior is for us. It's having a functional repertoire, a functional ACT repertoire, not a topographical ACT repertoire, not that I can open a metaphor book or a self-help book and say some things at a client and then hope and plan, but instead that I can identify, oh man, there's some inflexibility here. How can I add to the context to build it out in the presence of the aversive so that the person has more psychological flexibility, more freedom in the presence of functionally equivalent events out there in their world. So I would say, be demanding, ask people. I mean, certainly there's good training coming out of Praxis. There's good training coming out of Connections Behavior. There's good training out of a lot of the psychological societies and associations. I just did something for APS recently that's available on the web. So I would say, like, be a goods consumer and don't take off your behavior analyst hat. Know that your behavior analyst hat is useful even when people are talking, even when people are crying. If somebody's crying, the aversive is present. That means you get to work. That means you found your way to a space where you get to see this teacher or this supervisee or this assistant or this parent. Like, you get to see their repertoire falling apart. You get to hear, do the behavioral skills training while they're crying, right? Because that's when they're really going to need those skills is, when everything is falling apart and they feel like a huge failure. If you're practicing stuff when they feel super confident and comfortable and like you're right there to fix it, then that behavior is not likely to be, generalized out to the other situations in their life that evoke the sadness and anxiety and fear and all of this. So, all that stuff that a lot of times we feel really uncomfortable with when we're kind of in a more traditional ABA world, all of that stuff is stuff that actually tells us we're in a context that's a great time to work. We're in a context that actually we can see the repertoire when it's totally disrupted and messed up. And sometimes we have to ease in. We might we might throw them a life raft and ease the aversives back in, but it's a completely different way of thinking, I think, than how most of us typically think.
What you said just there reminded me of a story. When I was at Auburn University, a lot of my friends were in the clinical psych program. And I remember when they started seeing their first patients in the university counseling center, and when someone cried in session, it was like winning the lottery. They would like high five each other and stuff like that. They're like, yes, they cried. Awesome. They're like, probably for the same reason,
Yeah, well, it's like if there's something significant and painful here and I watch their repertoire just shut down, all of a sudden this really smart person can't be articulate. All of a sudden this really compassionate person is being a real jerk. All of a sudden this person that's so good at like planning and assessing their own behavior is like expressing all this hopelessness. Well, now I know if I build their repertoire here, right, in a context that's evoking their worst, in a context that's functionally similar to the worst stuff that happens out in their life, well, then they can go anywhere. Like, I think that's what Skinner intended for us, A freedom from aversive control doesn't mean things that have never functioned as aversives. It means, like, why not, as behavior analysts, take on transforming the function of aversives where they can be painful, but they don't have to shut down our repertoire.
All right. Awesome. You've probably piqued the interest of many a listener. So if people want to learn more about this stuff, do you have any suggestions for where they can look?
Yeah, sure. Well, so the book is forthcoming. That's a slow process.
Oh, okay.
But I'm certainly willing to share tons of resources. So I have some personal resources, note sheets and stuff like that I use. But there's also some webinars and stuff that I have out there. So I have a webinar out there with Dusty Dixon at Connections Behavior. I have a webinar out there with Australian Psychological Society. And those are really good samples of kind of what I do. If folks are looking to get a little bit, like a little taste of my learning history that resulted, at least, had a pretty serious impact on where I've landed. I think my favorite ACT book would be Kelly's Mindfulness for Two. There's a chapter in there. Chapter 2 is Clinician's Guide to Stimulus Control, and it's written for psychologists, but I think it could really give people a taste. That book is organized around the 6 processes, so I can certainly do that. But it really is a lot closer, I think, to a behavioral way of thinking, in part just because that was my mentor. That's Kelly doing that. And then I think other than that, I can't really say enough about creating consultation and like role play practice experiences. If folks are in a position to seek consultation with somebody that's expert, there's certainly plenty of us who do that. So me, Evelyn Gould, I know has some consultees, and that can be done in an individual or a group format. So I have a group of 5 people that meet all together. We have a very structured way of practicing. We do like doing a clinical role play, and then they'll just go, I'm stuck. And without like breaking character or anything, I'll give them some prompts and say like, okay, rewind 3 sentences, try this and see how that works. And their job is to assess, that functional relationship between what they're doing and what the client is doing. We do this really, really targeted skills practice. I have some people that I've met with for years individually. We watch tape of them doing ACT, and we find things to practice and find ways to build their repertoire. So I really don't think you can say enough about that kind of consultation. And if you don't have the funds, because most of us do this for a living, so if you don't have the funds to get an expert consultant, just having that opportunity to practice, taking a framework, all watching one webinar, getting one kind of consultation sheet or one sort of simple way of orienting towards this work, and then getting a group of people together who give each other the opportunity to practice, to the extent that you make those contexts that limit you present, then all of that practice is well worth it. So I would say if anybody's still stuck behind the book trying to wrap their head around it, like that's the plan and hope model. Let's not plan and hope. Let's get in there and start practicing and figuring out what your deficits are. And then you'll be a much better consumer of those workshops. If you know where your weaknesses are, when you're asking all those other questions, you can say, to what extent would this workshop help me with this deficit that I have? So being an informed and engaged consumer, not just buying the model as a set model, and being willing to trust yourself to be creative and generative with it.
Oh, awesome stuff. Thanks so much for joining me today. I think we got right up to the time in which you need to go. So
awesome.
Emily, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks so much, Matt. I'm really, really pleased. I love to talk about this stuff. So anybody who wants more of it should definitely reach out.
All right. We'll put something in the show notes where people can find you.
Cool. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.